Hello everybody and welcome back to Chaos Head. Let me go ahead and get my timer started and we can go ahead and pick up where we left off last time. A certain experiment took place, but she never knew of it. She was an ordinary housewife who had been blessed with her second child not long before turning 40. No, perhaps she wasn't utterly ordinary. If nothing else, her eldest daughter was about to enter high school, so there was a 15-year gap between her and the second child. She had been slightly worried that her eldest daughter would feel some resistance to this, as she was going through puberty. But on the contrary, the daughter rejoiced at her mother's pregnancy. Her husband, a scientist, rarely came home, as he immersed himself in his religion and his research. But he was a wonderful husband and father when at home. That was why, though she had some dissatisfactions, her love for her husband remained unshakable. Their second child was born safely, an energetic little girl, 2,575 grams. She named her Mana. Unfortunately, her husband had received a job assignment away from home immediately afterward. Her husband had absolutely nothing in the way of general homemaking skills, so they had to ask their reliable eldest daughter to go with them and help take care of him. She, who would now live out her days with the newborn Mana, just the two of them, moved into cheap corporate housing at her husband's suggestion. Originally, she had lived in a suburban condo, but it was located inconveniently with respect to transportation. But the company housing, her new residence, was in the best district in Shibuya, and many of her husband's co-workers' families lived nearby. Childcare was provided as well. Her husband had taken this into consideration so she wouldn't experience any trouble, just in case. All the rooms in the company housing were spacious, and she took a particular liking to her bedroom. There was an enormous mirror covering the whole wall, and in the opposite wall there was an enormous window. She could gaze at the greenery at Yoyogi Park there. Soon she befriended the lady living next door, and due to the exceptionally special treatment she received from the company, a housekeeper was assigned to her as well. She was satisfied with this lifestyle, in which she wanted for nothing, and she took pride in how it indicated the importance of her husband's position in the company. 2 years later, though her growth was somewhat delayed, Mana began growing up cheerfully, without contracting any major illnesses. She was very spoiled. If she did not hold her up against her breast, Mana would start crying piercingly. She herself had been in poor condition for about a month. She had an especially terrible ringing in her ears, and it bothered her practically all day long. Even then, she wouldn't let the housekeeper or her lady neighbor take care of Mana. In any case, she and Mana were attached at the hip, and they never parted. Neither when they went to the toilet or took a bath. If she thought about perhaps having the housekeeper hold Mana for a bit, Mana would sense this with extreme sensitivity and burst out crying. On the contrary, Mana's reliance on her made Mana even more precious to her. But as a result, she continued a lifestyle in which she couldn't take so much as a step out of the house. The housekeeper and her neighbor helped support this lifestyle of hers. She was truly fortunate to have met them. Then again, the two of them were gradually beginning to act stranger and stranger. About a week ago, when they were chatting in the living room, her neighbor vomiting without any warning. Disregarding her startle, the lady went flying outside. Because they hadn't encountered each other since then, she worried that maybe her friend had fallen ill. Thus, she requested the housekeeper go check on the lady's condition. When she conveyed this to the housekeeper, who had finished working and was about to leave, she said, "See you tomorrow." The housekeeper abruptly burst into tears and nodded countless times as she went home. That night, the tinnitus that had been tormenting her all the while grew more acute, and a splitting pain shot through her head. She tried to call an ambulance, but the phone wouldn't connect. She went outside to seek the help of the lady next door, but even that caused her great difficulty. Her daughter wept violently, and her voice further stimulated her pain. When she desperately embraced Mana and endured her suffering, all of a sudden the ringing in her ears and the weeping voice stopped. Her headache retreated as though it had been a lie. When she looked down, The child she held had become a mummy. Though she had been crying so loudly only a moment ago, at some point her body had decayed, dried up, and begun to give off a hideous smell. Her heart broke before she realized it had been an experiment. A certain experiment took place, but it differed from what he had hypothesized. He was a scientist at the Nozomi Technology Company, a follower of the Cosmic Church of the Divine Light, one of the central figures in Nozomi Technology's ultra-classified project in Noah, and the man who had deciphered FUN to the 10 times INT to the 40th equals IR2. He offered up his wife, then on the verge of childbirth, as an experimental subject, at the same time that this was an order from the revered founding father of this sect. It was also something he himself had suggested in order to make the experiment a success. It was called the Mana experiment, based on the codename given to the second daughter his wife had delivered. Entrusting his elder daughter, 15-year-old at the time, to a church facility, he spent 24 hours a day observing his confined wife and Mana. The room his wife had made herself think of as company housing was a test site prepared by Nozomi Technology, and the Noah 2 prototype he had developed was stationed there. Taking snapshots of people's thoughts, projecting images into their vision, controlling their 5 senses, the effects of all these were being tested out on his wife and Mana, the human subjects. Sorry about that. I think I paused in time, but on the off chance I didn't, again, sorry about that. The human subjects confined to the experimental grounds. The many ways in which electromagnetic energy affects the human body remain unnumbered, and naturally he had planned to halt the experiment if his wife or Mana experienced any physical abnormalities. The experiment met with an accident soon after its commencement. But a month after her birth, Mana died. The cause of death was unknown, an accident no one could have prevented. Overwhelmed with grief, he sought to stop the experiment, but he wasn't permitted to. So said his employer. His employer had been speaking of the grotesque spectacle inside the test site. Refusing to acknowledge Mana's death as reality, his wife held the child's dead body and treated it as if it were alive, and in fact her eyes reflected a living Mana. That was due to the influence of the Noah 2 prototype, and in a certain sense, it was the ideal situation under which to test its performance. They turned a deaf ear to his will. At last, he began to think that perhaps continuing the experiment like this would be to his wife's benefit. The wife he saw through a one-way mirror lived out every day in bliss, embracing her child's corpse. She talked gently to the child while gazing at the greenery of Yoyogi Park, which was a fake projected into her sight from the wallpaper made to resemble a window that was pasted to the wall. The lady next door, as well as the housewife, were research team staff members who took care of his wife undercover. As long as the experiment continued, his wife's heart would never be broken. He told himself it was for his wife's sake. Perhaps his heart had broken before hers did. At some point, his goal became not to complete Noah 2, but rather to allow his wife to go on dreaming. And so his employer declared a sudden end to the experiment, which had continued for close to 2 years. Oh, whoops, I didn't read that. He desperately resisted, but it got him branded a traitor and he was taken off the project. The day of the test site's closure, as their one kindness to him, they permitted him to present, albeit tied down. They permitted him to be present, albeit tied down in the laboratory. And his elder daughter, whom he had not seen in person for 2 years, was also compelled to attend. His daughter looked confused when she saw him.
父さん、これはどういうこと？母さんに何をしたの？母さんが抱いているのは一体。
He couldn't answer. Guilt over what he had done made him incapable of looking his daughter in the face. Meanwhile, the beginning of a ghastly ceremony approached. The neighbor had already become unable to endure Mana's putrid stench, and the housekeeper wept at his wife's words as she left the experiment site. And the equipment stopped, and the dream ended, and his wife broke. At the sight of her child, who to her appeared to have suddenly transformed into a mummy, she tore at her head, ripped out her hair, dug at the skin of her face with her nails, and in the end, began devouring her child's desecrated body. Laughing madly, she rammed her head into the wall, and finally stabbed a kitchen knife into her eyes. She died. His daughter screamed and cried, viewing the atrocity of her mother's last moments through a one-way mirror. Researchers held his daughter up on both sides and hauled her away somewhere. He was not allowed to chase after his one remaining family member. He blamed himself, believing he had brought all of it upon himself. Since the time 2 years ago when he made up his mind to continue the experiment, it should have been obvious to him, whatever his reasons may have been, that one day things would end up like this. Several days after his wife's death, he vanished. Now, no one knows where to find him. Afterward, Senna interrogated Kozapi about something. Wild-eyed, then finally sped on her way home, on her way alone. Kozapi went chasing after her, but I remained unaware of why Senna had suddenly started acting like a woman possessed. And now I was plodding through the neighborhood of Shimokitazawa. If I walked a little further, I'd reach my parents' house. It was less than a 30-minute walk from my base. I wondered if Nanami would be home. Though less so than in Shibuya, there were many people walking along the streets of Shimokitazawa. The Esper commotion continued to have a pronounced influence, and there were people who grinned mockingly when they saw me, and even took out their cell phones and snapped pictures. Devoured by humiliation and shame, I hurried along the road home. Rimi murmured, her eyes still lowered, as she walked a little behind me. In the time it had taken us to reach to this point, she had repeated the same thing about 10 times. Even if she apologized to me, there was nothing I could say in response. I didn't know Rimi. It had been that way since the first time we met. Rimi had supported me. Rimi had been there for me. But in the end, I still didn't understand a thing about her. The whole time, I'd let things stay that way, ambiguous, unresolved. Maybe because I'd had an inkling that once everything became clear, I wouldn't be able to stay with Rimi any longer. I feared that... Once I mustered my courage, it was all I could ask her. The reason why Rimi spent her time together with the likes of me. Was it because, after all, she was attempting to entrap me, the same as Yua? But the answer she gave back to me wasn't anything of the sort. She didn't want me to awaken as a gigalomaniac? Rimi knew more about me than I did. After some hesitation, Rimi said, In other words, she was telling me not to ask anything more. But I couldn't stop myself from asking. Which one is it? Was she trying to dodge the subject?
IR2 のこと知ってたの？
聞いたことがあるだけ。
She didn't say who she'd heard it from.
セナが言ってたのは本当なの？
嘘だよ。
A lie. The answer calling it a lie was itself a lie. I could tell from looking at Rimi's demeanor.
君は
I was about to demand even more answers of her, but I held my tongue. Was Rimi my enemy or my ally? If I asked, her response would determine whether or not I could be with her, so I couldn't ask her. If I had pretended nothing had happened, I could go on being deceived, and we could go on acting the same way as we always had until now. Maybe things would be easier and happier that way. Yes, that's what I'd do, and I'd feign being an idiot and let Rimi keep on fooling me. If nothing else, Rimi had helped me countless times, so she wouldn't seek to harm me from here on out either. I'd be fine with it if I did as she said, and lived an ordinary life.
ありがとう。
Averting my eyes from her, I gave voice to those words rather than to my questions.
守ってくれて。
だから
Unable to think of anything else to say, I silently continued down the road to my parents' house. At last, a familiar road came into sight, a small, quiet residential area. At times, I could hear the faint sound of a train speeding along somewhere far away. Scenery I'd known since my childhood, the place where I was born and raised. I traveled this road to go to both elementary school and middle school. If I entered the narrow road before me, my house would be nearby. I was scared of coming face to face with Nanami, but I couldn't bear not making sure of whether or not Nanami's hand was where it belonged. Calming myself by pausing to take some deep breaths, I started to step forward.
待って。
When I turned back, Rimi was looking at me with a face that seemed on the verge of crying.
どうしても行くの？ねえ、行かないで。もう普通じゃいられなくなるよ。私そんなの嫌だな。
What was that supposed to?
帰ろう。あのコンテナハウスに帰ろう。私タクが望む限りずっと一緒にいるから。それで一緒に学校に行って大臣と3人でたわいもない話をして、帰りに立ち食いそば屋さんとか CD ショップとかに寄って、そうやってこれからもやっていこうよ。
僕はナナミに会わなくちゃ。
いないよ、きっと。
How did she know? Was she lying again? Would it be bad for her if I visited home?
私タクの悲しむ顔見たくない。
That's how you...
もう謎かけみたいなことはやめてよ。
I'd had enough. Was she telling me to stay unaware of the truth forever? I couldn't feign idiocy, after all. Everyone kept thrusting mysteries at me, even though I'd wanted to remain ignorant.
実家に行っちゃいけない理由があるなら言ってよ。こんな中途半端なのうんざりなんだ。
Sick of it? Up until now, hadn't I myself been the one who chose to leave everything half-finished? Hadn't I been away from it all by my own will? Yes, which is why I ought to keep doing the same thing henceforth. Go back to my base, listen to Rimi. There was no need for me to see Nanami. What did I plan on doing if I went to check if her right hand were there and it wasn't? Wouldn't that mean it was my fault? Nanami would hate me. She would resent me. I was a pathetic guy who hadn't been able to rescue my little sister. Said fact would become written in stone. I wouldn't become a prisoner to guilt if I had left things ambiguous the way they were now. I should do that, it was the best possible choice. Don't look at anything. No matter how many mysteries are thrust at you, ignore them. Shut yourself away from the world.
ほんと世話が焼けるなナナがいないと何にもできないんだから。
ダメだ。
My mind recalled Nanami's bright voice.
ダメだよ。
If I fled here, I would never be able to face Nanami again for the rest of my life. I would never be able to return to my childhood home again for the rest of my life.
タク
I clenched my fists. I stepped into the narrow road leading to my parents' home. There were less than 50 meters from here to the house. At first, I walked on swift feet. Midway through, I started running, aiming for the house where I'd been born and raised. Another 30 meters. 20 meters. 10 meters. 0 meters. The house I knew so well wasn't there.
あれ
There was a different name on the nameplate. It wasn't Nishijo. For starters, the house wasn't shaped the same. The house I'd lived in was far newer and cleaner looking. I looked around. I thought I'd been off, that I'd gotten the neighbors. But I hadn't. In the first place, the surrounding scenery didn't match up with my memories. I thought maybe I'd gotten lost on the way, or I'd entered the road a block too early, but it couldn't be. I had recognized the route up till here. I'd remembered the streets alone. But the house wasn't there. When I walked along the road from my memory, the same landscape from my memory failed to emerge, and an unfamiliar scene spread out before me. I'd never seen it before. It was a place I'd become deeply familiar with, yet I had the sensation that I was coming here for the first time.
シャメビューだ。
違うよ
Rimi stood close behind me. She denied my words immediately.
この世界にタクの帰る場所はないの
Bright afternoon light shone into the hospital corridor. It was fairly dim during this band of time, immediately before the transition to night, since the indoor lights hadn't been turned on yet. The dinner time bustle had quieted a short while ago, and an almost eerie silence came floating down. The Shogun progressed slowly down the hallway in his wheelchair. The sound of it creaking wheels echoed through the corridor. Not one of the nurses he passed tried to say anything to him or meet his eyes. And Shogun, too, acted as if this were only to be expected, continued turning the wheels of his wheelchair with his emaciated skin and bone hands. As he passed in front of a certain hospital room, a male patient named Yami raised his voice. He pointed at Shogun and shouted frantically. As for the nurse who happened to be with Yami at the time, she wore a face of absolute perplexity.
アミちゃんが帰ってきたよ。またお外に出かけてたんだ。いけないんだ。
誰もいませんよ
Upon surveying the area, the nurse smiled wryly. She had said no one's there, despite the fact that Shogun was going down the corridor right in front of her in his wheelchair.
また山井さんは私のことからかってるんでしょうでも今日は騙されませんからね
アミちゃんラウミちゃんタウミちゃん
Yami went on shouting as though he'd gotten angry. Ignoring him, Shogun wordlessly turned down the hall to the right. There, the cream-colored wall abruptly went black. Even with the wall before him, Shogun didn't stop his wheelchair. The instant before, it seemed as though he were about to have a violent collision with the black wall. It unexpectedly vanished. It literally vanished into thin air. The wall disappeared, and the hallway behind it came into view. Shogun continued straight forward. About 20 meters down the corridor, he reached a dead end. This time for real. There was a single door. Shogun opened the door and went inside. It was an illusionary hospital room, a room no one knew, which had been whispered of in ghost stories for several years now. The name written on the nameplate for the hospitalized patient was Nishijo Takumi. Chapter 9. Okay, we're going to go and end this part here because I have 4 minutes left on my timer, and, well, it's pretty sure we're not going to be reaching a good stopping point within those 4 minutes, so, yeah. So that's going to be it for this part. I will see you all next time. Quick reminder, I do have a Patreon and a Discord. You can find links to those down below in the description. If you want to stay up to date with what's going on with the channel, I would highly recommend that you join the Discord. That is my go-to place for posting about anything that happens with the channel regarding my schedule. And any potential changes that will occur to it in the future. As for the Patreon, that is one of the 2 major ways to support the channel if you wish to go ahead and do so because you find yourself enjoying this content. Patreon, if you go that route, you get early access to videos. If you go the other route, which is to go and support it via Streamlabs, in which case you have the option of doing a one-time donation or a monthly donation, you don't get any goodies. You basically just get the good feeling that you know more of your money actually reaches the channel and is able to be spent by me to be able to do stuff for the channel. Because Patreon takes, if I recall correctly, it's a 5% cut, while Streamlabs, as far as I can tell, I believe the way I have it set up is that nobody's going to take a cut. I know Streamlabs themselves doesn't take a cut, but I'm pretty sure I have it set up in such a way that nobody takes a cut. So as a result, more of what you give, if not 100% of what you give, actually reaches the channel as opposed to what happens if you support the channel via Patreon. But again, if you go the Streamlabs route, you don't get any goodies. So it's entirely up to you if you really care about getting that early access to videos. But with that all said, like I said, that's going to be it for this video. I'll see you all next time. Excuse me. I'll see you all next time where we will be continuing this series. Again, we are relatively quickly-ish approaching the end, if I recall correctly. I believe I mentioned earlier, but if I recall correctly, there's only something like 10 or 11 chapters to this game. I think partly depending upon choices. I know there's like 4 endings for this game, if I recall correctly, 2 of which you only get if you've already completed an entire playthrough. This is the first playthrough that will be completed, so technically I will not have access to those 1 or 2 endings. I'm pretty sure it's 4 endings, but it might be 3. And in which case, one of them is dependent upon having completed the game at least once. I don't really recall exactly what it is, but nonetheless, like I said, we are fairly quickly approaching the end of this game. I don't know what will be replacing it. We probably still have another good, maybe 2-3 months, realistically, so we probably will be finishing this, what? Depending upon chapter lengths, we'd be finishing this... what, May, June-ish would be my guess. Because I'm recording this like right at the end of February. But yeah, so I'll see y'all next time. Till then, goodbye and farewell.